All right, hey everyone. My name's John Reeve, Senior Director of Product Management here at Oracle. And today I've got a quick talk here, hopefully 10 minutes or less. We're going to talk about enterprise cloud container platforms. So I hope everyone's having a great show so far. And in this talk, we're going to go really through what are the criteria if you really want to run your enterprise-based container applications in the cloud, and we'll look at that. Just to kick it off here real quick, so there's a quick survey here from a recent, I think it's a CNCF survey, sorry. But this was, I think, from last year or so. And basically what this is telling us, it was basically a survey to a number of practitioners in the Kubernetes space, and really talked about challenges to adoption of Kubernetes and containers and kind of what those big challenges were or folks are facing. The good news is a lot of the technology-related aspects, things like security, monitoring, storage, networking, the community's done a pretty good job around those kind of things. So we have things like CNI, the Open Network Interface. We have CSI for storage. We have standardized things like FluentD that we saw in the show today for logging and monitoring, and security's gone down as well. But a lot of the challenges in particular for enterprises adopting container-based solutions are really around these things of cultural changes. So, it's obviously a different way of delivering, building, deploying, and running applications with containers. Complexity is still very high, and lack of training. So there's obviously a plethora of things and open source solutions available here at the show, but having actual teams be able to adopt these is still obviously a big challenge. Similarly, another recent survey, I think this is actually from GitLab, just resistance to change, cross-team communications, best practices, again, overcoming some of those ingrained kind of ways that we work in the enterprise are really challenges to adopting some of these cloud-native technologies, right? So the typical enterprise today, we're pretty early in the market, right? So, there's obviously a lot of practitioners here. And the show's KubeCon's been going for a few years now. But in terms of if we look at the macro kind of market, if you like, and of all the customers that are transitioning to these technologies, we're still pretty early, right? We're probably in the very early stages of folks transforming or modernizing their applications on top of containers. In fact, we're kind of, obviously Docker started a lot of this with a lot of friendly APIs and making it easy to run containers and so forth. Kubernetes kind of took up the mantle in terms of how do we run distributed applications in production. But really, we're shooting for this kind of third phase here, which is, enterprises are adopting this technology in production for business critical applications, broad-based integration with their existing workflows and their existing ways of doing things. And we're still really on this journey right now. So what are some of the key criteria, right? If I step back and I'm saying I'm an enterprise, I want to try and adopt container technology in my enterprise, what are some of the big things, big ticket items I should be thinking about, right? So, right up front, oftentimes, as you probably know, as folks adopt this technology, they're going to adopt it in dev test, right? They're going to roll out, they're going to try it, and there's a lot of gains to be made there, right? In terms of improving our productivity, improving our efficiency, in terms of dev test, making my development teams more productive. That's typically how things roll out, but as I move to production, I've obviously got how do I do development, how do I do staging, how do I do production, how do I set up those Kubernetes clusters, how do I make sure I've got the right permissions and the right team members with the right levels of access for those different environments. So there's a lot of things that happen in terms of just partitioning out your environment and making sure you're ready to move things through the lifecycle. Lifecycle management's also key. So it's one thing to stand up a Kubernetes cluster. It's another thing to actually upgrade it, right, in production, do so in a zero downtime way, make sure all my applications are persisted and so forth. So obviously I want an environment where I can easily move from one Kubernetes to another, version to another. There's new versions coming out every 3 months or so. Networking. Networking is a huge aspect. We saw that the CNCF's done a great job of standardizing some of the open networking interfaces, but there's still questions that need to be answered in terms of how do I do isolation, for example? Am I going to have multi-tenant Kubernetes clusters? So, for example, in a development scenario, it's pretty common to share a cluster between different development teams? Am I going to use namespaces to partition those? How am I going to do that? How do I make sure I have isolation between those different teams that are maybe running in production? Typically, I'm going to have some kind of on-premises real estate. I'm going to have some existing applications I might need to connect to. How am I going to do that? So these are key criteria as well. If I'm talking about business critical applications, typically I'm talking about storing some kind of state. So that means storage. How do I do that in terms of, how do I set up my block storage? How do I persist my application state? Do I need multi-read-write access? There are some applications, older applications in particular, that might need shared read-write access, things of that nature. We talked a little bit about users and teams. How do I partition my environment? How do I, give the different folks in my teams the right level of access to their different clusters, whether that be in development, staging, or production? Ideally, I want that integrated with how I do identity today. So, for example, with a lot of cloud providers, you have identity and access management. I want to make sure that the way that I set up my users, the way that I do access management on my cloud provider integrates natively with how I might run Kubernetes on that cloud. There are other things, obviously, there's just a ton of things in security, but these are some of the top ones. And what mission controls are you going to run? So in production, in an enterprise setting, typically I might want to use something like pod security policies. How do I enforce that when a container runs, it's running according to the spec or the policy that my enterprise has in terms of, I don't want it to run as root. I want to make sure that it's pulling trusted images from my trusted repositories. I want to make sure those things are signed and approved and so forth. We talked about role-based access control. Private clusters. What's the level of privacy that I'm comfortable with in terms of my workloads having access to the internet or being maybe completely isolated from a network perspective? Talked about scanning and signing. Obviously, it kind of goes without saying that, if I'm consuming a managed Kubernetes service, I want it to be highly available. I want it to be running all the time. I want it to be multiple master nodes, multiple API servers, etcd nodes, all the rest of it. And I want to make sure that it conforms to an SLA, essentially, that I would expect from an enterprise. Observability. We hear a lot about observability here at the show. Really key topic, right? It's one thing to take my applications to production, but I better have a good framework of how I can monitor those things, get logs from those things, get telemetry, root cause issues when they occur and when they arise. Obviously, service mesh is another item there that's potentially very beneficial in terms of traceability and visualization of my applications. How do I integrate this with my CI/CD pipelines? So, obviously, I want to try and get as automated as I can there. Automate the testing. Obviously, a great number of problems that end up in production are from changes that are introduced, right, from software changes. I want to make sure I can get a handle on those. I want to make sure I can get ahead of those in terms of testing and integration. And then just integration. Kubernetes is necessary. I like to say necessary, but not sufficient. It's a good start. It gives you a good framework. But there's a lot of other things that I need to consider, obviously, that we've talked about. But things like, how do I support third parties on my cluster? Obviously as an enterprise, I have a lot of existing providers or third parties that I work with, and I want to make sure that I can support those. I want to make sure that I have a set of open interfaces to my container or my cloud environment, my container platform. Whether that be things like provisioning clusters, using things like Terraform to set up open tooling, APIs, etc. So obviously, I want to build on this framework, and I'm going to want to be able to do integration around it. So those are some of the quick ones. This is kind of a drill down into perhaps what we're looking at. One of the things we announced here at the show, here at Oracle, is the OCI open source service broker. So a service broker, for those that you don't know, is a way to basically, it runs inside your Kubernetes cluster, and it allows you to essentially hook up your applications or your containers to typically other services that the cloud provider might provide. So in our case, we're allowing you to natively from inside of Kubernetes connect your cluster to things like the Oracle Autonomous Database, your Autonomous Data Warehouse, object storage, streaming services, and more to come as well. So we're very good for developers that want to, again, where we can, let's use managed services. Kubernetes is great, but in many cases, cloud providers have done a lot of heavy lifting for us to run these services so that we don't have to operate them. And where we can, we should use those. Istio's in the mix here, showing an embedded service mesh as part of the cluster. I have the marketplace up top here, being able to install third-party applications. And then we have an API gateway in here as well. And again, all built on a solid foundation of governance, compliance, security, policy management. These are very important as you obviously move your applications into production. Okay, well that was a very quick lightning talk. Some of the key things you should take away when you're looking at enterprise container platforms. Hope that was useful. And feel free to come up with any questions. Thank you.